We've heard a lot from economists about energy and climate plans in this election, and it's perfectly fair because we have carbon pricing, we've got the effect on various industries like oil and gas, national grids, that sort of thing. But there's a need for a different lens on this, and I'm going to turn to Dr. Monica Gattinger, who's director of the Institute for Science, Society, and Policy at the University of Ottawa today. So welcome to the interview, Monica.
Thanks for having me, Markham.
Now, you are not an economist, so let's take your broader policy lens to this. What's your take on the energy and climate platform so far?
Well, I think it's really important the way you frame this, Markham, because when I look at the I've looked predominantly at the three major parties' platforms, and when I look at them, I really look at them through two lenses. The first is to say, it is what they've proposed on the climate front kind of feasible and going to get them to where they want to go from an economic modeling perspective. And then the second thing I look at, and this brings really the policy lens to it, is, well, what about, moving beyond models into the real worlds of politics, energy security, society, federalism, energy regulation. And I think those two lenses are really important to bring to the discussion. So when I think, for example, about all three of the parties, this is the first election where we've really had a serious climate plan put forward by the Conservative Party. I think that's very interesting and important development. They actually developed that plan with the support of independent economic modeling. And so if you run the party's plans through economic models, and I'm sure you've heard this in your other interviews, both the Liberal and Conservative plans come out as achievable for the targets that they've set for themselves and the measures that they've put in place. The NDP plan doesn't fare quite so well in terms of lack of specificity and impacts on the economy. But moving beyond that, what about how implementable these plans are? I think that's what the policy lens brings, is the implementation. And from my perspective, what you see in both the Conservative and Liberal plans, and to some extent as well in the NDP plan, is, have they really gotten it right in terms of thinking through how this is going to happen when it comes to Fed-Prov relations, when it comes to reconciliation with Indigenous peoples, when it comes to energy affordability and reliability. And I think there I would say that both plans have some shortcomings on those fronts.
Well, I have a question for you about the Liberals' plan to cap greenhouse gas emissions in the oil and gas sector. And because energy is the purview of the provinces, so mostly that we're talking about Alberta here, but to a lesser extent Saskatchewan, they've not been open to federal meddling in their sandbox. So how implementable do you think that proposal is?
Well, that's a huge open question for me. So, the party platform lays out that they would cap emissions at the current level and then put in place targets to reduce them in 5-year increments in the years ahead, and that they would look to the net zero advisory body to feed into setting those targets. I think, this is going to take some real political skill if this is the road they want to go down in terms of interacting with the provinces on this. That said, we have major producers in the oil sands having come together on the Pathways to Net Zero Alliance. So you've got industry wanting to do this. There could actually be some interest there from the part of industry to be on the same page as government, to have the support of government moving forward. So it's a very open question, though. That's going to take a lot of collaboration, a lot of political leadership and skill and craftsmanship. That's a big open question for me.
The NDP has not gotten a lot of attention this election for its energy and climate plan, and there are some good ideas in there. The idea of a climate bank, they're open to carbon budgets, which has been a little controversial. What's your take on the implementability of some of the NDP planks in their platform?
I think that's a great question, Markham. And, I think there's some big open questions there about implementability of that plan. They've committed to a 50% reduction of emissions by 2030. I mean, that's cutting them in half in 8.5 years. I just, that to me is just not feasible. And again, with credit to the NDP, when they develop their plan, they're not necessarily thinking about, we're going to form government and how will we actually implement this. So they don't necessarily put as much effort into the implementability piece. But what they do, and the NDP has historically done this in Canada, is bring forward new interesting ideas that the other parties can think through. And I think, that the climate bank is an interesting one. They've talked about an environmental justice office. I think that's a very interesting piece. They've talked about a climate core for youth. Also a very interesting idea. Carbon budgets, I would have some very big questions there. It's really questionable to me how one would go about implementing that at an economy-wide or sectoral basis. But some of those other ideas to me are really worth exploring.
Yeah, policy analyst Seth Klein made the point to me in his interview that the NDP and the Greens shouldn't be penalized for having greater climate ambitions in a time of a climate crisis. And that really is a political issue, isn't it?
I think that's right. And again, we always have to be careful about confusing or conflating climate ambition with what can actually be implemented. And I think we look to those parties, the NDP, the Greens, for that ambition to be pushing the major parties, on climate. And I think to be bringing forward ideas that the major parties might want to consider and adopt.
So what about the CPC plans here? Now, you mentioned that they're more credible, and I think that everybody agrees. The economists have not been kind as a rule. I think of, Mark Jackard and Jen Winter and Michael Bernstein. All of those economists have taken their red pens to the CPC plan. What's your take on that from an implementability, from a political lens?
Well, I think, the big development here that really is, to my mind, crucial is that they actually have a plan that's credible. And I think this is the first election where we've got all of the parties on the same page. They're more duking it out on the how and, sort of where do you calibrate various instruments and the like, rather than the whether of climate action. That said, the Conservative Party, I think, has a credibility challenge. The question, so yay, you've got a plan, modeling shows that it will get you to where you've set targets for, but will the party actually implement that plan if it comes to power? I think that to me is a really open question, but there's a lot to like in it, I have to say, in terms of thinking through the role of Indigenous communities with in energy transition and in energy more broadly. I think there's a lot in there around collaboration with the provinces and working with the provinces. I think that's also very positive, working with industry. I think that I quite like that collaborative tone, because to my mind, collaboration is going to have to be the cornerstone of emissions reductions in this country going forward.
Let's talk about it from an institutional point of view, Monica. And the first thing that pops to mind is the Liberal proposal for a pan-Canadian grid council that designed to collaborate with the provinces and bring more east-west trade in electricity between the provinces, build out a more infrastructure like grid interties, that sort of thing. What's your take on that?
Well, I think these issues are going to be crucial, for Canada to capitalize on, how low emitting its electricity system is. But again, that varies across the country in terms of the generation profile in each province. We've got all of these, systems that have been built up largely within the provinces. This is not an area of federal jurisdiction. It certainly is in terms of interprovincial and international infrastructure, and the federal government has tended to really have quite a light touch or even a no touch on that front. The question to my mind is, are they going to start to become a little bit more assertive going forward? The Grid Council is potentially a really interesting idea if it's structured in a way that really is collaborative and that, squares that circle of, we've got provinces with jurisdiction with their own policy and regulatory frameworks. Is there a role there for the federal government to help put in place and foster more collaboration? I would say yes is the answer there, but it has to be done in a way that really, instills confidence in the provinces. If not, it could backfire and really blow up in their faces.
Now, you're a political scientist, and I know you spent time studying, the Canadian Federation, which is fairly decentralized. The federal government does not have a lot of authority around energy and resources, and that makes it makes it a little difficult sometimes when you're coming up with national objectives and national strategies, because a lot of it has to be implemented at the provincial level, which gets us into the politics of this. And, which party might have the deft touch, the deft political touch to forge alliances and coalitions and make these things happen. That's no small thing when it comes to implementing energy and climate plans. What's your take on the political leaders and their ability to, forge those coalitions?
Well, I think, I'm going to kind of respond in the following way. It partly depends on who's sitting at that Fed-Prov table, right? So if we think back to when the Liberals came into power in 2015, we had, for the most part, federal government and the provinces singing from the same song sheet. That was a time where there was a window opportunity that they seized. They, negotiated the Pan-Canadian Framework on Clean Growth and Climate Change. That put into place the opportunity for creating a carbon price that applied across the country. I think it really, a lot of this boils down to who are the interlocutors and can they come together in a way, that they trust one another and that they can, work towards common objectives. And there, I think it's really going to be interesting to see how an incoming federal government squares that circle, the way in which they come together with the provinces and with the territories on this question. Because for a lot of it, Markham, I think I find it hard to imagine at this point in time that we could get a federal, provincial, territorial agreement along the lines of the Pan-Canadian Framework, just given the political profile at the provincial level currently. So what that might mean then is that we're going to move more in the direction of, sort of piecemeal collaboration of federal government with a number of provincial governments or a number of provincial governments coming together to collaborate. And I think that's where, I'd really be looking to, and certainly you see this in some of the party platforms, that respect for provincial autonomy and the willingness and desire to collaborate with the provinces on shared objectives.
I think that respect for provincial autonomy, there's three different perspectives here on the major parties. The CPC, in my take, would be that they would respect more provincial autonomy. They would interfere, quote unquote, less, and particularly because we have many conservative provincial governments right now. The Liberals would be in the middle, and the NDP would be the most aggressive with the federal state. Is that a fair characterization?
I think that's a fair characterization, Markham. I think, the big issue here, though, is federal governments really need to, think through, yes, respecting that provincial autonomy, but also making sure that they're pulling the country in a united direction. And that is really, really challenging to do. I think, there are the Liberal government really pushed on the carbon tax. And I think, to their credit, really pushed on the carbon tax to the point we now have a price on carbon that applies across the country. Did that cost them in terms of relationships with a number of provincial jurisdictions? Yes. Right. So it's really challenging politically to move forward on these issues, and it takes that political leadership to think through what are the topics where pushing makes sense and what are the topics where taking a lighter touch, fostering that collaboration is a more prudent approach. Because I think the more we get into the how of energy and climate, the more we are going to be raising the specter of challenges around national unity. And that's going to take an incoming government that's really strategic about where is it going to take the country on energy and climate.
Well, let's wrap up our conversation, Monica, with discussion of political narrative, because this is something that you and I have talked a number of times about. Your institute has done work on that. And I think we're agreed that Canada is polarized around energy and climate at the moment. Does this election do anything to lessen that polarization? And are we likely to see a change in the narrative, the energy and climate narrative going forward?
I think we're at a really interesting, tipping or turning point, depending on how you want to think about it, Markham. We've been doing a lot of public opinion polling research over the last year around Canadians' climate ambition. And the level of climate ambition of Canadians has grown from, just under 1 in 2 Canadians said now is the best time for ambitious climate action in June of last year. And that's gone up to 2 in 3 in August of this year. And we're seeing more agreement on that amongst Canadians. But then when we ask Canadians, how confident are you that Canada can actually reduce emissions? There they raise some really interesting ideas around not trusting governments because they've broken promises in the past, not trusting industry, feeling that industry is dragging its heels. But I think this election is really pivotal in that we've got all the parties who are, pulling in the same direction, differently, admittedly, but pulling in the same direction on climate. That might start to, open things up in Canada around bringing those energy and climate communities together, starting to reduce some of the division in our debates over energy and climate in this country, and hopefully setting Canada on a path forward to bend that emissions curve down once and for all.
Monica, interesting conversation as always. Thank you very much for your insights.
Great. Thanks so much, Markham.